Sophia hunched over the chipped kitchen table, her weary eyes tracing the chaos of scattered papers. Unpaid utility bills curling at the edges, like dying leaves. Half-written grocery lists abandoned in despair. Reminders she'd scrawled in a trembling hand and promptly ignored. The apartment's silence buzzed in her ears, a relentless drone that smothered her racing mind, pressing against her temples like a tightening vice. Her fingers lingered over a cold coffee mug, its contents untouched for hours, a grayish film settling over the surface like a shroud of neglect. At 34, she felt decades older, her spirit frayed by a life she'd let stagnate since her mother's death 3 years ago, a wound that bled anew with every quiet moment, every echo of her mother's voice calling her name in dreams. She'd always been a loner, more at ease navigating the labyrinth of her own thoughts than enduring the unpredictable clamor of others' voices, laughter too loud, questions too probing. But lately, the solitude pressed harder, the walls of her cramped one-bedroom apartment closing in like a trap, snapping shut around a wounded animal. Friends like Clara, her college roommate who'd once filled her days with warmth and late-night talks about their dreams, Clara to be a painter, Sophia to write, had faded into sporadic, unanswered texts, Sophia's silence a fortress they couldn't breach. Her ex-husband, Mark, had walked out 5 years prior, his parting words a knife still twisting. "I can't live with a ghost. You're gone even when you're here." Therapy had been a brief, failed experiment, too raw, too exposing, the counselor's gentle questions peeling back layers she couldn't bear to face, her mother's death a shadow she couldn't outrun. Now the apartment was her cocoon, its dimness a shield against an outside world she no longer trusted or understood, a world that moved on while she stood still. The space exhaled unease, a living entity with a pulse of its own, slow and menacing. Thick beige curtains, stained with years of dust and neglect, smothered the daylight, casting the room in a perpetual dusk that blurred reality's edges into a dreamlike haze. The hardwood floors groaned under her hesitant steps, each creak a protest against her presence, while the plaster walls bore faint, spidering cracks that seemed to widen with her every glance, as if the building itself resented her. A mildew scent clung to the air, sharp and sour, evoking the damp basement of her childhood home where she'd hidden during her parents' shouting matches, her mother's voice pleading, her father's slamming doors. Clutter sprawled across every surface, old books with cracked spines, trinkets from her mother like a porcelain bird she'd once cherished, a chipped vase she couldn't discard despite its ugliness. It was a museum of a life frozen in time, as if altering it would erase her mother's voice. Her soft laugh that crinkled her eyes, her quiet reprimands when Sophia stayed up too late, her off-key humming over the stove as she stirred soup on cold nights. Her gaze drifted to the hallway, where the guest room door hung slightly ajar, a sliver of shadow spilling out like spilled ink across the faded rug. She rarely approached it, a habit born of dread that had grown over weeks into a palpable, gnawing fear, a whisper in her gut she couldn't silence. Lately, it felt alive, watchful, its shadows pooling too stubbornly to shift with the light, as if they had weight, intent. The silence thickened, a suffocating blanket, as if something held its breath, waiting for her to notice its presence lurking just beyond sight, its gaze a cold finger down her spine. With a heavy sigh, she stood to close it, her bare feet cold against the creaking floorboards, the chill seeping into her bones like a warning she couldn't heed. As her hand brushed the doorknob, a faint rustling, like paper crumpling in a distant room, froze her, her breath catching in her throat, a gasp she swallowed. She peered inside. A bare mattress sagged in the corner, springs poking through like ribs. A dusty lamp flickered weakly, casting jagged shadows that danced like specters. Nothing stirred. Yet the air felt charged, heavy with an unseen weight squeezing her lungs, pressing her chest until her ribs ached. Her pulse quickened. Someone, something, watched her, its presence a tangible force. Slamming the door shut, she twisted the lock with fumbling fingers, the click echoing like a gunshot in a cavern. She needed air, needed escape from this suffocating tomb. But the feeling clung, a shadow she couldn't outrun, a silent scream building in her throat. Morning crept into the apartment, dim and reluctant, the light barely piercing the dust-laden curtains hanging like shrouds over the grimy windows. Sophia moved through her routine, brewing coffee in a machine that sputtered like a dying engine, its wheeze a mockery of life, shuffling papers into haphazard piles that toppled with every touch. But it felt off. A melody played on broken strings, discordant and jarring to her frayed senses. The coffee machine's hum roared in the oppressive silence, grating her nerves. Each sound, a needle pricking her skin, raising goosebumps along her arms. She couldn't shake the sensation of eyes boring into her back, tracking her faltering steps through the gloom, a gaze that lingered like a touch she couldn't brush off. Order was her lifeline, a fragile thread she clung to in a world that felt increasingly chaotic and unmoored, slipping from her grasp. Keys on the entry table by the door, coffee poured at 8 sharp, papers sorted by noon, rituals anchoring her against the flood of her thoughts, a dam against the tide of memories threatening to drown her. But today, chaos slipped through like water through clenched fists, relentless and cold. Her keys were gone. She stared at the empty table, heart thudding in her chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the silence, pulsing in her ears like a drumbeat of panic. She'd placed them there last night after locking the door. Meticulous, obsessive, checking the bolt twice, her fingers lingering on the cold metal as if to assure herself of safety. A frantic search ensued, kitchen counters strewn with crumbs and coffee stains. The bathroom sink, where a toothbrush dangled precariously over the edge. The pockets of her frayed coat hanging by the door like a forgotten sentinel. Its fabric rough against her hands. Nothing. Had she imagined it, her mind fraying at the edges like old cloth? Or had someone been inside while she slept, their presence a ghost slipping through her defenses? She found them on the couch, centered perfectly on a faded cushion, as if placed with deliberate care, not tossed or dropped in haste. Her breath hitched, a cold sweat prickling her skin, raising the fine hairs on her neck as a shiver raced down her spine. She hadn't touched the couch since yesterday evening, when she'd collapsed there with a book she couldn't focus on, its words blurring into nonsense. Across the hall, a shadow flickered. Mr. Hensley, the nosy neighbor with rheumy eyes and a perpetual scowl, peering through his cracked door, his silhouette hunched and predatory. "Lost something, girl?" he rasped, voice a gravelly scrape that set her teeth on edge, his yellowed teeth glinting in the dim light. "Saw you fumbling last night, looked spooked, pacing like a caged thing." She muttered a vague reply, "Just misplaced them," and retreated, unease coiling tighter in her gut like a snake tightening its grip. Was he watching her, his curiosity more than idle, his presence a constant hum across the hall? Later, a sharper shock jolted her from her spiraling thoughts, snapping her back to the present with a jolt. In the living room, the photo of her and her mother, the last one, taken at a windswept seaside cafe where the air had tasted of salt and freedom. Her mother's laughter ringing over the waves lay face down on the floor beneath the mantel. It had been upright that morning, a painful keepsake she rarely touched but couldn't discard, its frame a silent accusation of her failures. Her hands trembled as she righted it, the glass cool and accusing against her skin, reflecting her pale, haunted face, eyes sunken with sleepless nights. Had she knocked it over in a distracted moment, her arm brushing it as she passed in a daze? She couldn't recall, and the frame was intact, its fall too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to dismiss as clumsiness. Her mind raced, grasping for explanations in the dim light that cast long, twisted shadows. Mr. Hensley? No, he rarely left his apartment. His shuffling gait too slow for stealth, his arthritis-ridden hands too clumsy to move unseen. She checked the locks, secure, as always, the bolts unyielding under her insistent tugs, the metal cold and reassuring. Yet the guest room door loomed in her peripheral vision, its presence heavy, almost mocking, a dark maw in the hallway's gloom that seemed to breathe. That night, in bed, the shadows stretched longer across the ceiling, the silence deeper and more suffocating, a blanket of dread settling over her. A rustling broke it, soft but distinct, emanating from the guest room like a whisper of movement, deliberate and close. Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs, sweat beading on her brow as her breath quickened. She listened, rigid with fear, until it stopped, leaving only the echo of her own ragged breathing. No one could be there. The windows were latched, the door locked, yet the certainty grew. Something watched her, waited for her to falter, its gaze a weight pressing down, a silent promise of worse to come. Days bled into a fog of dread, each dawn tightening the invisible vice around Sophia's chest, squeezing until her breaths came shallow and sharp, her lungs burning with every inhale. She blamed stress, exhaustion, anything but the truth creeping closer, its claws sinking deeper into her mind, drawing blood from old wounds. The disturbances grew, insidious and unrelenting, weaving a web she couldn't escape, its threads tightening around her heart. Photos began appearing, old, intimate snapshots of her life, surfacing like ghosts from a forgotten grave, each one a splinter under her skin, sharp and festering. The first slid out from under a stack of unopened mail, its edges curling like a dying flower. A faded image of her at 6, laughing at a picnic she couldn't place, surrounded by relatives whose faces blurred in her memory, her mother's sister perhaps with her sharp nose, or a cousin long lost to time, their voices a distant hum. Her hands shook as she studied it, the paper brittle under her fingertips, yellowed with age, smelling faintly of dust and regret. She hadn't kept such photos here. Her albums were packed away in a storage unit across town, untouched since the move 3 years ago, a decision made in the numb haze after her mother's funeral. More followed, materializing like specters on the counter, the coffee table, each a shard of her past piercing the present with cruel precision. Her graduation day, cap askew as she grinned nervously, her mother's proud smile, a beacon in the crowd. A teenage trip with her mother to the coast, waves crashing in the background, her mother's arm around her shoulders, the salty wind tangling their hair. Private moments, locked deep in her memory, now exposed and raw, their edges worn, as if handled by unseen hands, their presence a violation she couldn't comprehend. A flashback seized her without warning, vivid and merciless. Her mother's hospital room, sterile and cold. The air, thick with antiseptic and despair. The phone, ringing unanswered as Sophia sat frozen in her apartment miles away, too afraid to hear the inevitable goodbye, too paralyzed by the weight of her own inadequacy to pick up. She'd failed her then, left her to die alone. The nurse's voice is a faint murmur through the lines she'd ignored, and the guilt gnawed anew, a wound that bled fresh with every beat of her heart, staining her soul with its crimson tide. One night, a notebook appeared on the coffee table, its leather cover worn and cracked, pages yellowed and curling at the edges like decaying leaves, its weight heavy with secrets. It wasn't hers. She'd never seen it before, its presence an intruder in her carefully ordered chaos, a silent taunt. Inside, meticulous notes tracked her life in a spidery hand. Dinners of reheated soup scribbled in haste, bedtimes at 11 marked with precision, outfits of faded sweaters and jeans catalogued like evidence in a trial, paired with sketches of her apartment, her face in repose, captured in moments she hadn't known were watched. Some were precise, capturing the slant of her jaw, the hollows under her eyes, where sleepless nights pooled. Others warped, her features twisted into something nightmarish, eyes too large and dark, mouth a gaping scream that echoed her silent terror. The final page bore a scrawled message. I am always watching you. Her blood ran cold, a shiver racing down her spine, chilling her to the marrow, her fingers trembling as she dropped it, the thud loud in the stillness. She tore through the apartment, checking every corner, every shadow, her flashlight beam slicing through the gloom like a blade, its light trembling with her hand. The guest room, unlocked now despite her efforts to secure it with a chair propped under the knob, felt alive with stale air and unspoken secrets, its emptiness mocking her with its stillness, the mattress a silent witness to her fear. Sleep fled as the noises began, creaks of the floorboards like footsteps pacing just out of sight, whispers on the edge of hearing, the wind rattling windows like a restless spirit clawing to get in, its howl a mournful cry. Then, clear as a bell, she heard it. Sophia, a soft voice seeping from the walls, intimate and chilling, familiar yet alien, her mother's tone twisted with something darker. She bolted upright, scanning the dark room with wide, frantic eyes, her breath fogging in the sudden cold that gripped the air, her skin prickling as if touched by frost. It was empty, the shadows still, yet the presence pressed closer, suffocating her with its weight, a hand she couldn't see tightening around her throat. She stumbled to the door, checking the locks again, fingers fumbling over the bolts, her nails catching on the metal, scraping painfully. They held firm, unyielding, but the voice called once more, louder now. Sophia! Her name a summons, a taunt that echoed in her skull, reverberating until her head throbbed. Something, or someone, was here, unraveling her sanity thread by thread, pulling at the seams of her reality. Mr. Hensley shuffled past her door, his shadow a hunch in the hall, muttering, Heard that, too. Old place talks, keeps secrets. His words lingered, heavy with meaning she couldn't grasp. Was he part of this, his constant watching more than nosiness? The whispers grew into a chorus, overlapping, accusing, a cacophony of her name that drove her to the floor, back against the wall, clutching her knees as her chest heaved. The guest room door creaked wider, a black void in the hallway's gloom, its darkness beckoning like a grave. Something watched, feeding on her fear, and she knew it wouldn't stop until it consumed her entirely. Sophia's fear sharpened into a blade, cutting through her every thought with a cold, relentless edge, her days a tightrope, walk over a chasm of panic that yawned wider with each step, threatening to swallow her whole. Then a knock shattered the silence, jarring her from her spiraling dread, the sound sharp and insistent like a hammer on glass. Mr. Calder, the reclusive landlord, stood at her door, his gaunt frame hunched under a threadbare coat that smelled faintly of mothballs and stale tobacco, his eyes darting like a cornered animal's beneath a shock of gray hair matted with sweat. Heard noises, he muttered, voice low and rough, cracked from disuse, his breath a faint wheeze. Old building creaks, sure, but it's more than that. Check the attic. Been meaning to tell you about it, should have done it sooner. She frowned, confusion cutting through the fog of her dread, a lifeline she grasped at. An attic? She'd lived here 3 years, pacing every inch of this prison, memorizing its groans and sighs, and never noticed an access point. No one had mentioned it when she signed the lease in a haze of grief, desperate for a cheap place to hide. He shuffled inside without invitation, his boots scuffing the floor with a gritty rasp, leaving faint trails of dirt, and pointed to a trapdoor in the guest room ceiling, barely visible under layers of peeling paint and grime, its outline camouflaged by years of neglect, a secret embedded in the walls. Curiosity warred with the dread pooling in her stomach, a nauseous tide rising, churning with bile that burned her throat. Armed with a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, its beam weak but steady, flickering like her resolve, she dragged a rickety chair beneath it, the wood creaking ominously under her weight as she climbed, her knees trembling with each movement. Prying the trapdoor open with a screwdriver she'd found in a junk drawer, dust rained down, stinging her eyes and coating her tongue with a gritty bitterness as she ascended into a cramped, shadowed space, the ladder groaning like a dying thing. The air was thick, stale with decades of neglect, lined with cobwebs that brushed her face like ghostly fingers, clinging to her hair and eyelashes, their touch cold and invasive. A chill prickled her skin, raising the fine hairs on her arms. Something felt wrong, alive with secrets that pulsed in the dark. A heartbeat she couldn't locate. Amid the clutter, moldy cardboard boxes spilling yellowed newspapers, a broken lamp with a shattered shade casting jagged shadows. A wooden chest caught her eye, its lid warped but intact, carved, with faint initials she couldn't decipher in the dim light, their edges worn smooth by time. Inside, she found faded letters tied with twine, their ink smudged by years. A tarnished locket that wouldn't open, its surface warm to the touch, as if alive. And a photo of her mother, younger, radiant, her dark hair loose and wild, standing with a man Sophia didn't recognize, his arm possessive around her waist, his smile sharp-edged and cold. Her stomach twisted, a nauseous wave crashing over her, bile rising in her throat as her vision swam. Who was he? Her mother had never spoken of this place, this life, never hinted at a past beyond the quiet suburban home Sophia had known as a child. Calder's voice drifted up from below, thin and reedy, cutting through her shock. Used to be her place, before you moved in. She left in a hurry, didn't take much, left debts, too, that I covered. Her mother had lived here? Why had she kept it secret, buried it like so much else, like the arguments Sophia had overheard as a girl, the ones her mother dismissed with a tight smile? That night, the whispers grew louder, sharper, cutting through the haze of her thoughts like a knife through flesh. Sophia, look closer. It wasn't her imagination, it was her mother's voice, real and anguished, echoing from the walls with a clarity that froze her blood. Her heart pounding so hard, it hurt. She sat up in bed, breath shallow, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird beating its wings. Was Calder hiding something? Some dark history tied to this place, to her mother's past? A thread she hadn't pulled? Or was the apartment itself alive with her mother's ghost, reaching out from a time Sophia had never known, a life erased from her memory? She clutched the photo, her mother's smile, a taunt, a riddle she couldn't solve. And the room seemed to tilt, the shadows deepening as if the building itself conspired to keep her trapped in its secrets. The locket, now in her pocket, pulsed faintly, a heartbeat against her hip. Its warmth unsettling, as if it knew her, watched her too. Calder's words echoed, debts he'd covered. What had he meant, and why did his eyes flicker with something like fear when he'd said it? Sleep became a battlefield. Sophia's mind, a prisoner to the whispers that haunted her nights. Each one a thread pulling at the seams of her sanity, unraveling her stitch by stitch. The photos, the notebook, her mother's voice, they weren't random, disconnected fragments scattered by chance, but pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. Sitting in the dim living room, tracing the chipped edge of her mug with a trembling finger, the truth crashed into her like a tidal wave, knocking the breath from her lungs, leaving her gasping. The observer was her guilt, yes, but it was more. It was her mother, reaching from beyond the grave, tethered to this apartment by a bond Sophia couldn't yet fathom. A connection forged in pain, silence, and something darker, something hidden in the shadows of this place. Memories surged, unbidden and relentless, flooding her senses with vivid, merciless clarity. Her mother's frail hand slipping from hers in the hospital bed. The skin cool and papery, the beep of machines a death knell she couldn't silence. Her own fingers too weak to hold on. The call she'd ignored 3 years ago, too paralyzed by fear to answer. Staring at the phone as it vibrated across the table. Knowing it was the end. Knowing she'd failed. Mark's weary exit, his voice breaking as he packed his bags. I can't reach you anymore, Soph. You're a ghost in your own life. His suitcase wheels, scraping the floor like a goodbye. Clara's unanswered pleas to reconnect, her letters piling up unopened in a drawer. A friendship she'd let wither because facing it meant facing herself. You failed me, the voice hissed, no longer just in her head but reverberating from the walls, clear and piercing. Her mother's tone laced with sorrow and accusation, cutting deeper than any blade. She'd buried the pain, the regret, and it had festered, summoning this presence, a fusion of her self-loathing and her mother's restless spirit, a haunting she'd built with her own hands, brick by brick, over years of silence. The room pulsed, shadows coiling like tendrils as she sank to the floor, sobbing. I'm sorry, her voice cracking, raw with years of suppressed grief that poured out in a flood, soaking her shirt with tears. The whispers softened, her mother's tone shifting from anger to a plea. Find the truth. She'd created the observer with her guilt, but her mother's ghost fueled it, trapped by secrets Sophia didn't yet grasp. Secrets hidden in the attic, in the chest, in the life her mother had concealed behind a mask of normalcy. Her hands clenched into fists as she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, but it pressed closer. You can't hide from me. The air grew heavy, the walls seeming to breathe with her heartbeat fast and erratic. A rhythm of panic she couldn't escape, the floorboards trembling beneath her as if alive. She'd spent years running from herself, from the pain of her mother's death, from the choices that defined her isolation, choosing silence over connection, retreat over courage, a coward's path she'd paved alone. Now it stared back at her, undeniable and alive, a mirror of her failures reflecting every missed chance. The photos she'd found, the notes she'd read, they were her own repressed memories clawing to the surface, amplified by her mother's lingering presence, a cry for acknowledgement she couldn't ignore. The guest room door creaked open on its own, a sliver of darkness beckoning like a portal to her past. She stumbled toward it, flashlight in hand, the beam trembling as it cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in a silent waltz. The trapdoor above gaped like a maw, and her mother's voice whispered again, "Look closer." It wasn't just guilt, it was a call to uncover what had been hidden, a truth buried in the bones of this place, in the life her mother had lived here before her, a life Sophia had never questioned until now. Her chest tightened, fear and resolve warring within her as she climbed the chair, the wood groaning under her weight, her knees shaking with the effort. Whatever waited in the attic, it held the key to her torment and her redemption. She couldn't run anymore. The observer, her guilt, her mother, wouldn't let her, its presence a weight that pinned her to this moment. The flashlight beam flickered, and the whispers grew into a chorus. Find me, Sophia. A desperate plea that echoed in her soul, pulling her upward into the dark. A memory flashed, her mother's voice years ago, soft and strained. Don't trust everyone, Soph. Some secrets stay buried for Had she meant this place, this life? The realization hit like a punch. Her mother had known something, feared something, and now it was calling her name, drawing her into its depths with a force she couldn't resist. Driven by her mother's voice, Sophia returned to the attic, the flashlight trembling in her grip as she climbed the ladder, each rung a step deeper into the unknown, the metal cold and slick with her sweat. The space felt smaller now, the shadows denser, pressing against her like a living thing, their edges sharp and cold, slicing through the stale air. She rifled through the wooden chest with frantic hands, shoving aside letters, tied with frayed twine, pleas for forgiveness, cryptic warnings, and trinkets like glass beads that clinked softly until she found it, a journal, its pages brittle and yellowed, the ink faded, but unmistakably her mother's handwriting, looping and precise, a handwriting Sophia had once traced with crayons as a child. Entries chronicled a life Sophia hadn't known, a man named Daniel, a love that turned toxic, nights of whispered arguments escalating to threats, his voice a growl in the dark. "He thinks I'm dead," the last page read, dated weeks before her supposed hospital death. The words scratched in haste, ink smeared with what might have been tears or blood. "I hid here after he attacked me, staged my escape with Calder's help, but he'll find me. I know he will." Her breath caught, a sickening realization dawning like a storm breaking over a calm sea, thunder in her ears. Her mother hadn't died of illness. The hospital story was a lie, a fiction she'd swallowed without question, fed to her by a family too ashamed to admit the truth. Daniel had killed her, and she'd covered it up with Calder's aid, retreating to this apartment to escape his wrath, to vanish from the world she'd known. The room trembled, the voice crying, "He's still here!" Her mother's tone a wail of terror and rage that shook the rafters, dust cascading like ash. A shadow loomed behind her in hall. Calder, descending the ladder, his face pale and drawn, sweat beading on his brow, eyes wild with something like fear or guilt, his hands twitching as if itching to grab her. "You shouldn't have looked," he rasped, voice cracking, stepping closer, his boots thudding on the wood. "Should have left it buried. Some things don't let go." Reality blurred as the attic darkened, the air crackling with energy, a static hum that raised the hairs on her neck, prickling her scalp. Her mother's ghost materialized, pale, furious, her dark hair streaming as if caught in an unseen wind, her eyes boring into Sophia's with a desperate intensity that burned. "Free me," she pleaded, her voice a wail that reverberated through the wooden beams, shaking dust loose in clouds that choked the air, stinging Sophia's eyes. Sophia stumbled back, the journal slipping from her hands, its pages fluttering to the floor like dying birds, torn between the tangible threat of Calder and the hallucination unraveling before her, a vision too real to dismiss. "What did you do?" she demanded, voice breaking, tears stinging her cheeks as she faced him. Calder's laugh was brittle, hollow, a sound of despair laced with menace. "I helped him, Daniel, found her bleeding out, made it look natural, took her debts, her secrets, kept them quiet. She begged me to hide her, but he finished her anyway, right here, under this roof." The ghost lunged toward him, a spectral fury, her hands clawing at the air, nails sharp as memory, and the attic erupted, boxes toppling with a crash that echoed like thunder, dust swirling in a storm of rage that blinded her, grit grinding between her teeth. Sophia grabbed the journal, clutching it to her chest as proof of the truth, its weight grounding her in the chaos, her mother's words a lifeline. Her mother's death wasn't her fault, not entirely, but a murder she'd never suspected, a betrayal hidden in plain sight by Calder's hands. The line between reality and madness frayed, her mother's presence both a torment and a guide, urging her forward with a force she couldn't deny. Calder reached for her, his fingers grazing her arm, rough and calloused, but a shelf collapsed, pinning him with a groan of splintering wood, his cries muffled by the debris, his legs trapped as he thrashed. Sophia scrambled down the ladder, heart pounding, the journal her only anchor as the attic roared behind her, her mother's ghost a fading scream in the dark. Calder's voice followed, weak but venomous. "You'll pay for this. Hensley knows too." Hensley. The neighbor's muttering flashed back, secrets the old place kept. Had he seen it happen, witnessed Daniel's crime? The revelation hit like a second blow. This wasn't just Calder's cover-up, it was a conspiracy, a pact between men who'd buried her mother's life and death, and now they'd turn on her to keep it silent. The apartment shook, the walls groaning as if protesting the truth, and she knew she wasn't safe. Not yet. Not until she understood the full scope of what she'd uncovered. Sophia stood in the living room, the journal trembling in her hands, its pages creased and warm from her grip. Calder trapped above as the attic groaned with her mother's fury, a tempest of grief and vengeance that rattled the bones of the building. The ghost flickered before her, a pale figure of rage and sorrow, her mother's face contorted, eyes blazing with a fire that burned through the haze of Sophia's fear, her dark hair whipping as if caught in a storm only she could feel. "You're Daniel," Sophia accused, voice shaking, the name a poison on her tongue, though Calder's words sowed doubt, twisting in her mind. "No, just the keeper of her secrets," he'd said, his voice strained with panic as he'd thrashed under the debris. "She died here, alone, blood pooling on the floorboards. I cleaned it up, couldn't let the cops dig deeper, not with Hensley watching." The ghost wailed, "Liar!" the sound rattling the windows, a storm of grief unleashed that shook the apartment to its foundations, glass trembling in its frames. Sophia clutched the journal tighter, its pages a lifeline to the truth she'd uncovered, a truth that rewrote her past with brutal clarity. "I'll tell the world," she vowed, tears streaming down her cheeks, hot and bitter against her skin, pooling at her chin. "I'll free you, Mom. I promise." The ghost softened, her mother's voice whispering, "Forgive yourself," a faint, tender plea that cut through the chaos, a balm to the wound she'd carried. Calder's shout pierced the air. "Ye ruin me!" And he lunged down the ladder, freed from the debris, his face a mask of desperation, eyes wild with terror, hands outstretched as if to throttle her. The room erupted, furniture shaking, lights flickering as if struck by lightning, as her mother's spirit surged, a force of vengeance that filled the space with crackling energy, a hum that vibrated in Sophia's bones. A bookshelf toppled, trapping him again, his curses muffled by the crash of splintering wood, his hands clawing at the air in futile rage. Sophia stumbled to the phone, dialing Clara with trembling fingers, the numbers blurring through her tears, her vision swimming. "I need you," she choked out, her voice raw, the first plea in years breaking through the wall she'd built around herself, a wall she'd thought unbreakable. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every heartbeat, she sank to the floor, the journal open beside her, its words a testament to her mother's hidden life, Daniel's violence, her flight, her murder disguised as illness, Calder's complicity a stain on every page. The whispers ceased, the air stilling as her mother's ghost faded, a final sigh of release brushing Sophia's cheek like a caress, soft and fleeting. Later, with the journal in police hands and Calder detained, his protests fading into the night as cuffs snapped shut, the apartment grew quiet, truly quiet. Not the suffocating silence of before, but a peace she hadn't known in years, a stillness that felt like forgiveness. She stood at the window, sunlight streaming through the glass, warming her tear-streaked face. The world beyond no longer a threat, but a possibility. A canvas she could paint anew. Clara arrived, her footsteps soft on the floorboards, her embrace a lifeline Sophia hadn't known she needed, strong and warm and real, smelling faintly of turpentine from her latest canvas, a painter still chasing her dreams. "I'm here," Clara murmured, her voice steady, and Sophia clung to her, the dam of her isolation breaking at last, years of solitude crumbling in the safety of that grip. "I thought I'd lost you too," Clara added, her eyes bright with unshed tears. A bridge, rebuilt in an instant. Sophia had faced her guilt, the call she'd missed, the years she'd lost to silence, and uncovered her mother's murder, a truth that freed them both from the shadows that had bound them. The scars remained, etched deep. Grief for her mother, regret for the connections she'd severed, the life she'd let slip away. But they no longer ruled her, no longer chained her to the dark. Mr. Hensley's voice echoed from the hall as police questioned him. Saw Calder with a man, Daniel, years back, blood on their hands, arguing in the stairwell. Kept quiet, too scared. His confession sealed Calder's fate, a witness to the conspiracy she'd unraveled. She'd broken the mirror of her torment, shattering the observer's hold. Her guilt, her mother's ghost, the weight of a past she could finally release. Stepping into the sunlight with Clara's hand in hers, Sophia felt the first stirrings of hope. A fragile light blooming where darkness had reigned, a life she could reclaim, piece by piece, breath by breath.